ID, aliens, and God. We're going to look at an article that's from December 12, 2016, so it's fairly recent. It's from the New York Times on the opinion pages, and it's called, "Can Evolution Have a Higher Purpose?" Now, of course, if you read the standard evolutionary literature, the answer will be absolutely not. That's the whole point of having evolution, is to get purpose out of biology. But this is asking a question, and it almost sounds like the answer should be yes. Well, as we'll find out, the answer might be yes, at least according to Robert Wright. Let's take a look. By the way, you can find this on the internet for free. So if you can't take down the reference, just wait till this afternoon. It will be up on the internet, and then you can freeze the frame. Or those of you who get the email, you can click on reference 1. Robert Wright, for what it's worth, this is from the bottom of the article, is the author of The Moral Animal, Non-Zero, and the Evolution of God, and a visiting professor of science and religion at Union Theological Seminary. I didn't know they had those animals, but apparently they do. The article starts, "About 25 years ago, a conversation between me and one of the greatest biologists of the 20th century took a weird turn. I was talking to William D. Hamilton, who is famous for coming up with the theory of kin selection, which explains patterns of altruism among close relatives in various species, including ours. This and other seminal ideas has earned Hamilton a place in the pantheon of thinkers who ushered in modern-day Darwinian understanding of social behavior. Richard Dawkins, in the preface to his landmark book, 1976 book, The Selfish Gene, paid tribute to Hamilton and the three other dominant figures in social biology whose ideas formed the book's foundation." So, if you're running in those circles, William Hamilton is big cheese. I was interviewing Hamilton at the University of Michigan, where he was on sabbatical from Oxford. A video camera was rolling. I had been researching a book about evolutionary psychology, and I was hoping to create a documentary on the subject. The documentary never materialized, and Hamilton died in early 2000. My interview with him sat unwatched until earlier this year when I tracked down the tape containing it. So this is actually data from way back, but re-examined in 2016. During the interview, I was trying to steer Hamilton towards philosophical topics, and at one point he went further than I had expected. He said, "I'm also quite open to the view that there is some kind of ultimate good which is of a religious nature, that we just have to look beyond what the evolutionary theory tells us and accept promptings of what ultimate good is coming from some other source." That doesn't sound exactly like Dawkins, does it? That's an unusual thing for a great evolutionary biologist to say, but the most unusual part was still to come. Hamilton continued in his British accent, "I could enlarge on that in terms of the possible existence of extraterrestrial manipulators who interfere and so on, but I think this would be getting too far from the general topic of discussion." Well, maybe, but this sounded at least as interesting as the general topic of discussion. I asked him if he meant that there was some kind of transcendental purpose that we humans are generally oblivious to. He answered, yes. There's one theory of the universe that I rather like. I accept it in an almost joking spirit, and that is that planet Earth in our solar system is a kind of zoo for extraterrestrial beings who dwell out there somewhere. And this is the most interesting experiment they could set up, to set up the evolution on planet Earth going in such a way that it would produce these really interesting characters, humans who go about doing things, and they watch their experiment, interfering hardly at all, so that almost everything we do comes out according to the law of nature. But every now and then they see something which doesn't look quite right. This zoo is going to kill itself off if they let you do this or that. So he continued, these extraterrestrials insert a finger and just change some little thing. And maybe those are the miracles which the religious people like to so emphasize. He reiterated, I put it forward in an almost joking spirit, but I think it's a kind of hypothesis that's very, very hard to dismiss. Whoa. That's not what you expect. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come back, but first we're going to put up a YouTube that's embedded in the article. So let me see if I can make this work here. Okay.
I'm also quite open to the view that there is some kind of ultimate good which is of a religious nature, that we just have to look beyond what the evolutionary theory tells us and accept promptings of what ultimate good is coming from some other source. I could enlarge on that in terms of the possible existence of extraterrestrial manipulators who interfere and so on, but I think this would be getting too far from the general topic of discussion.
Okay, but are you referring partly to the prospect of a transcendental purpose to which we are oblivious as well?
Yes. There's one theory of the universe that I rather like. I accept it in an almost joking spirit, and that is that planet Earth in our solar system is a kind of zoo for extraterrestrial beings who dwell out there somewhere, and this is the best thing that the most interesting experiment they could set up the evolution on planet Earth going in such a way that it would produce these really interesting characters, humans who go around doing things. And they watch their experiment interfering hardly at all, so that almost everything we do comes out according to the laws of nature. But every now and then they see something which doesn't look quite right. This zoo is going to kill itself off if they let you do this or that. So they insert a finger and just change some little thing. And maybe those are the miracles which the religious people like to so emphasize. I think it's I put it forward in an almost joking spirit, but I think it's a kind of hypothesis that's very, very hard to dismiss. I mean, if I were setting up an aquarium or something, this is virtually the way I would do it. I'd try to make as interesting an aquarium as I could, and I'd try to make sure that this big fish didn't molest this little fish too much, and I would occasionally insert a finger and try to stop him, and how could we actually prove that that wasn't happening in some of these alleged miracles that go on in our world?
So, I mean, he actually said that. The headline almost writes itself. World-class scientist says miracles can happen. The subhead would add, extraterrestrials may play a role. But that's the headline you'd write if you were just trying to maximize clicks. If you wanted to capture the philosophical significance of what Hamilton was saying, you'd take another tack. Rather than focus on miracles, you'd focus on the idea of higher purpose, the idea that there's some point to life on Earth that emanates from something that is in some sense beyond it. And in hopes of generating as many clicks as possible, notwithstanding the philosophical significance. Wait a minute. So we're going to try to get the clicks for something else, I guess, that's more noble. More noble than miracles, so now we're talking about higher purpose. You'd put this in listicle form, which he's going to do now, laying out several misconceptions that Hamilton had implicitly dispelled. You could call these the three great myths about evolution and purpose. Myth number one, to say that there's in some sense a higher purpose means that there are spooky forces at work. When I ask scientifically minded people if they think life on Earth may have some larger purpose, they typically say no. If I ask them to explain their view, it often turns out that they think that answering yes would mean departing from a scientific worldview, embracing the possibility of supernatural beings, or at the very least of immaterial factors that lie beyond scientific measurement. But Hamilton's thought experiment shows that isn't necessarily so. Haven't we heard that kind of argument before? In intelligent design, for example, it could be aliens, it could be God. But there it's rejected. Here, Hamilton is accepting it. And Wright is implicitly accepting it as well. There must be a reason for that. You may consider aliens spooky, but they're not a spooky force. And they're not supernatural beings. They're just physical beings like us. Their technology is so advanced that their interventions might seem miraculous to us, as various smartphone apps would seem to my great-great-grandparents. But these interventions would in fact comply with the laws of science. So it helps that the aliens are not miraculous. But they look miraculous. More to the point, if you ask how Hamilton's aliens had initially imparted purpose to life, the answer is that they did so in concrete fashion, by planting simple self-replicating material on Earth a few billion years ago, confident that it would lead to something that would keep them entertained, keeping them entertained being, in this scenario, life's purpose. And before we move on to number 2, think about that. Implicitly, this is saying that the origin of life is a really tough problem and we haven't solved it yet. Maybe this is the solution. Notice that? They know the origin of life is a tough problem.
To the great controversy here.
Yeah, well, maybe a great controversy. Which leads to myth number 2. Remember, these are the in listicle form. To say that evolution has a purpose is to say that it is driven by something other than natural selection. The correction of this misconception is in some ways just a corollary to the correction of the first misconception, but it is worth spelling out. Evolution can have a purpose even if it is a wholly mechanical material process. That is, even if its sole engine is natural selection. After all, clocks have purposes. To keep time, a purpose imparted by clockmakers, and they're wholly mechanical. Of course, to suggest that evolution involves the unfolding of some purpose is to suggest that evolution has in some sense been heading somewhere, namely towards the realization of its purpose. Which leads to myth number 3. Evolution couldn't have a purpose because it doesn't have a direction. Think about this. The idea that evolution is fundamentally directionless is widespread, in part because one great popularizer of evolution, Stephen Jay Gould. Oh, well, in part to many. I don't think Stephen Jay Gould is alone on that. He worked hard to leave that impression. As I and others have argued, Gould was at best misleading on this point. And anyway, even Gould admitted that, yes, on balance, evolution tends to create beings of greater and greater complexity. How do we know this? Well, does the theory say it has to? Well, they'll go on and argue that if life spreads, then it has to spread into everywhere, including very complex organisms. And so therefore, it will have a purpose even if it doesn't have one. A number of evolutionary biologists would go further and say that evolution was likely, given long enough, to create animals as intelligent as us. Maybe they would be dolphins or parrots or something, but they would be intelligent. In fact, that idea is implicit in Hamilton saying that aliens could have set up evolution in such a way that it would produce these really interesting characters, humans. This part of Hamilton's scenario requires no intervention on the part of the aliens. Well, in Hamilton's view anyway, because he believed that evolution by natural selection has a kind of direction in the sense that it is likely, given long enough, to produce very intelligent forms of life. When speaking more precisely, as he did in other parts of the interview, Hamilton would say that the human species per se wasn't in the cards, that it wasn't inevitable that the first intelligent species would look like us. And of course, any of you have seen the movie or pieces of the movie or heard of the movie Planet of the Apes understands exactly what he's referring to. Maybe there would be apes that would be intelligent and the humans would be stupid. With these three myths dispelled, you're left with this philosophically liberating. So there's a tight spot in the philosophy of standard evolutionary theory. Ooh. We didn't admit that before, did we? But apparently you need something to liberate you from that tight spot. You can entertain the possibility that evolution has a purpose, a kind of goal, a telos, as philosophers say, without departing from a strictly Darwinian view of evolution. Without abandoning belief in natural selection as evolution's only engine. Why is it so important that Darwinian natural selection is evolution's only engine? Why is that? And without surrendering your credentials as a modern scientifically minded kind of person. That's even more interesting. That somehow, if you believe in purpose, it was previously equivalent to surrendering your credentials as a modern scientifically minded kind of person. What does that tell you about the definition of science from that perspective? In case you're still feeling a little uneasy about becoming a purpose ponderer, just to ponder purpose is enough to make you uneasy. I should emphasize that not all teleological scenarios that pass scientific muster involve space aliens. Indeed, some scientists have suggested that natural selection has a purpose that wasn't instilled by any kind of intelligent being. This scenario emerges from one version of physicist Lee Smolin's theory of cosmological natural selection. Smolin thinks our universe may itself be a product of kind of evolution. Maybe universes can replicate themselves via black holes, so that over a lot of time, you get universes whose physical laws are more and more conducive to replication. So that's why our universe is so good at black hole making, because it was evolved to happen that way. I guess. In some variants of Smolin's theory, intelligent beings can play a role in this replication once their technology reaches a point where they can produce black holes. Whoa. Well, has our universe's technology evolved to the point where we can produce black holes? That implies a universe with multiple universes, because there's natural selection that happens all the time, of civilizations that are orders of magnitude greater than our own. That is, those aliens are out there. And they can do stuff that we can't dream of. That puts intelligent design in a whole new light, doesn't it? This might explain the much discussed observation that the physical constants of this universe seem fine-tuned to permit the emergence of life. Ooh. The physical constants of the universe seem fine-tuned to permit the emergence of life, and that doesn't fit standard theory. But isn't that one of the arguments for intelligent design? Of course it is. These people feel the force of the argument. And now that they have something they can blame it on other than God, they're quite happy to say that. Think about that. What that tells you is that underneath the bluster that, oh, we don't need God, the arguments are actually quite strong that you need some kind of a designer. And as long as the designer isn't God per se, they can live with that. But it gets even more interesting. Crane told me that in this scenario, human life, and I don't mean on an individual scale, but as a whole, has a purpose in the same sense that a chicken's egg has a purpose. The purpose of a chicken's egg is to create a chicken. Some philosophers are comfortable talking about animals having a purpose imbued by natural selection to spread their genes. So if biological evolution is a product of cosmological natural selection, it has a purpose in a defensible sense of that term, and we're part of that purpose. You ever heard the complaint that evolution doesn't really have a purpose and that's a downer for human life? Why are we living if we don't have a purpose? And people saying, no, I'm glad it doesn't have a purpose. Well, guess what? There are people for whom they really do find that an argument, but they don't dare say that. And now that they have an alternative, they can dare say that. So we add another item to our listicle, myth number 4. If evolution has a purpose, the purpose must have been imbued by an intelligent being. Wouldn't that be nice? It's imbued by an unintelligent being or by just nature. That said, one interesting feature of current discourse is a growing openness among some scientifically minded people to the possibility that our world has a purpose that was imparted by an intelligent being. Ooh. I'm referring to simulation scenarios in which holds that our seemingly tangible world is actually a kind of projection emanating from some sort of mind-blowingly powerful computer, and the history of our universe, including evolution on this planet, is the unfolding of a computer algorithm whose author must be pretty bright. Way brighter than anybody I know, for what it's worth. You may scoff, but in 2003, the philosopher Nick Bostrom of Oxford University published a paper laying out reasons to think why we are pretty likely to be living in a simulation, and we'll go over those reasons later. Neil deGrasse Tyson, you know who he is? You do. Let's just say that he has not been friendly to theism or to intelligent design, finds it plausible. The visionary will find out how plausible he finds it. The visionary tech entrepreneur Elon Musk says there's almost no chance that we're living in base reality. The New Yorker reported earlier this year that 2 tech billionaires, it didn't say whether Musk is one of them, have gone so far as to secretly engage scientists to work on breaking us out of the simulation. Although it's not clear how you would do that. I'd like to take to note an irony. When an argument for higher purpose is put this way, that is, when it doesn't involve the phrase higher purpose, and further is cast more as a technological scenario than a metaphysical one, it is considered intellectually respectable. You see, what's not intellectually respectable is higher purpose that is metaphysical. That is to suggest that behind the physics of our earth there is something else going on. That's not intellectually respectable. I don't mean that there aren't plenty of people who dismiss it. I'm talking about how people dismiss it. The Bostrom paper drew flack, but a lot of it was from people who thought the chances that we're living in a simulation are way less than 50%, not from people who thought the idea was wholly crazy. You see, it's wholly crazy to have metaphysics. It's not wholly crazy to think that we're in a simulation. If you walked up to the same people who gave Bostrom a respectful hearing and told them there is a transcendent God, ooh, many would dismiss the idea out of hand. Yet the simulation hypothesis is a God hypothesis. An intelligence of awe-inspiring power created our universe for reasons we can speculate about but can't entirely fathom, perhaps unless he told us. And assuming this intelligence still exists, it is in some senses outside of our reality, beyond the reach of our senses. And yet, presumably, it has the power to intervene in our world. Theology has entered secular discourse under another name. Truth to power. Personally, I'm fine with that. I think discussion of higher purpose should be respectable, even in a scientific age. I don't mean I buy the simulation scenario in particular, or the space alien scenario, or the cosmological natural selection scenario. But I do think there's a reason to suspect that there's some point to the exercise we Earthlings are engaged in. Some purpose imbued by something, and that even if identifying that something is for now hopeless, there are grounds for speculating about what the point of the exercise is. I won't elaborate much on this since I've done that elsewhere, arguing that a higher purpose can be framed as a hypothesis and that evidence for or against the hypothesis can be marshaled. But I will say that the evidence I see for purpose includes not just the direction of biological evolution, but the direction of technological evolution and of the broader social and cultural evolution it drives. You see, it's not just about biology. It bleeds over into sociology and culture. And if the purpose involves sustaining this direction, becoming a true global community, then it would seem to include moral progress. So before this, moral progress wasn't something you could get. But now, you can, without God. In particular, our purpose would involve transcending the psychology of tribalism, which would mean, in the light of recent political and social developments in the United States and abroad, that our work is cut out for us. It sounds like he doesn't like Trump very well. Well, what about this hypothesis that we're in a simulation? Several physicists have suggested that our universe is not real and is instead a giant simulation. Should we care? This is according to the BBC. We might live in a computer program, but it may not matter. And it's by Philip Ball, and again, this is relatively recent. Are you real? What about me? These used to be questions that only philosophers worried about. Scientists just got on with figuring out how the world is and why. But some of the current best guesses about how the world is seem to leave the question hanging over science, too. Several physicists, cosmologists, and technologists are now happy to entertain the idea that we are all living inside a gigantic computer simulation, experiencing a matrix-style virtual world that we mistakenly think is real. Our instincts rebel, of course. At least other people in the BBC's instincts rebel. It all feels too real to be a simulation. The weight of the cup in my hand, the rich aroma of the coffee it contains, the sounds all around me. How can such richness of experience be faked? But then consider the extraordinary progress in computer and information technologies over the past few decades. Computers have given us games of uncanny realism, with autonomous characters responding to our choices, as well as virtual reality simulators of tremendous persuasive power. It is enough to make you paranoid. And skipping on, the idea that we live in a simulation has some high-profile advocates. In June 2016, technology entrepreneur Elon Musk asserted that the odds are 1,000,000,000 to 1 against us living in base reality. Similarly, Google's machine intelligence guru Ray Kurzweil has suggested that maybe our whole universe is a science experiment of some junior high school student in another universe. Although in that case, their high schools are incredible. What's more, some physicists are willing to entertain the possibility. In April 2016, several of them debated the issue at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, U.S. And moving on, cosmologist Alan Guth of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, U.S., has suggested that our entire universe might be a real, yet still a kind of a lab experiment. The idea is that our universe was created by some superintelligence, much as biologists breed colonies of microorganisms. There's nothing in principle that rules out the possibility of manufacturing a universe in an artificial Big Bang filled with real matter and energy, says Guth. Moving on, however, there's a second scenario, and it is this one that has garnered all the attention because it seems to undermine our very concept of reality. Musk and other like-minded folk are suggesting that we're entirely simulated beings. We could be nothing more than strings of information manipulated in some gigantic computer like the characters of a video game. University philosopher Nick Bostrom of the University of Oxford in the UK has broken down this scenario into three possibilities. As he puts it, either, one, intelligent civilizations never get to the stage where they can make such simulations, perhaps because they wiped themselves out first, nuclear holocaust, or they get to that point but then choose for some reason not to conduct such simulations, or we are overwhelmingly likely to be in such a simulation. That is, once you do simulations that good, then presumably the creatures that you simulate could try it again on themselves. And moving on, some scientists argue that there are already good reasons to think we are inside a simulation. One is the fact that our universe looks designed. Ooh, it really is a powerful argument. They've just been ignoring it. The constants of nature, such as the strength of the fundamental forces, have values that look fine-tuned to make life possible. Even small alterations would mean that atoms were no longer stable or that stars could not form. Why this is so is one of the deepest mysteries of cosmology. Moving on, others have pointed out to some of the truly weird findings of modern physics as evidence there's something amiss. Quantum mechanics, the theory of the very small, has thrown up all sorts of odd things. For instance, both matter and energy seem to be granular. What's more, there are limits to the resolution with which we can observe the universe. And if we try to study anything smaller, things just look fuzzy. Is the universe pixelated? A second argument is that the universe appears to run on mathematical lines, just as you would expect from a computer program. Ultimately, say some physicists, reality might be nothing but mathematics. Max Tegmark of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology argues that this is just what we would expect if the laws of physics were based on a computational algorithm. I'm skipping some of the arguments against for what it's worth. Does it make a difference if that information were programmed by nature or by superintelligent creators? It is not obvious why it should, except that, in the latter case, presumably our creators could in principle intervene in the simulation or even switch it off. How should we feel about that? So that if it's a computer simulation, whoever's running the computer could change things at will. Miracles are in principle possible. Tegmark, mindful of this possibility, has recommended that we had all better go out and do interesting things with our lives, just in case our simulators get bored. What happens if our simulators have a moral feeling and think that, for example, killing 300,000 people in some country is not really a good idea? Raises some interesting questions, doesn't it? I think this is said at least half in jest. After all, there are surely better reasons to want to lead interesting lives than that they might otherwise be erased. but it inadvertently betrays some of the problems with the whole concept. The idea of superintelligent simulators saying, look, this run is a bit dull, let's stop it and start another, is comically anthropomorphic. Like Kurzweil's comment about a school project, and imagine our creators as fickle teenagers with Xboxes. But it does recall a biblical text where the Lord repented that he had made man. Doesn't it? And that's the end of what I have excerpted. There's even, you can look at the debate yourself if you want to, at a site in space.com. And I'm sorry for the university, that should not be there. Is the universe just an enormous, fantastically complex simulation? If so, how could we find out, and what would that knowledge mean for humanity? These were the big questions that a group of scientists, as well as one philosopher, tackled on April 5 during the 17th annual Isaac Asimov debate here at the American Museum of Natural History. The event honors Asimov, the visionary science fiction writer, by inviting experts in diverse fields to discuss pressing questions on the scientific frontiers. Notice that this is, well, if not part of science, certainly someplace where science is going. Neil deGrasse Tyson, our atheist friend, director of the museum's Haydn Planetarium and host of this year's event, invited 5 intellectuals to the stage to share their unique perspectives on the problem. Zora Davuti, a nuclear physicist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology; Max Tegmark, whom we've heard from earlier, a cosmologist at MIT whose recent book probes the universe as mathematics; James Gates, a physicist at the University of Maryland who discovered strange error-correcting codes deep in the equations of supersymmetry; Lisa Randall, a physicist at Harvard University who thinks the simulation question is more or less irrelevant; and David Chalmers, a philosopher at New York University who regularly questions the reality that conscious minds perceived. And here's a shot, and if you look here, there's Neil deGrasse Tyson standing with the other 5 people seated in a, I wouldn't call it a semicircle, but in a kind of a arranged seating there. And he interviews them, and they speak, and he speaks, and then he wraps it up. And the same conference is referenced in Scientific American under the title, "Are We Living in a Computer Simulation?" High-profile physicists and philosophers gathered to debate whether we are real or virtual and what it means either way. And one should have noticed, moderator Neil deGrasse Tyson, director of the museum's Haydn Planetarium, put the odds at 50-50 that our entire existence is a program on someone else's hard drive. Although probably it wouldn't be a hard drive, it would be some other kind of thing in that universe. I think the likelihood may be very high, he said. He noted the gap between human and chimpanzee intelligence, despite the fact that we share more than 98% of our DNA. That, of course, as some of you know, is a demonstrable myth. But it's still, I think that it's easily 3/4 or above. Somewhere out there could be a being whose intelligence is that much greater than our own. We would be drooling, blithering idiots in their presence, he said. If that's the case, it is easy for me to imagine that everything in our lives is just a creation of some other entity for their entertainment. So, in fact, he thinks that the probability is 50-50, that we're in a simulation. Skipping on, but there were some more contemplative, but some were more contemplative, and saying the possibility raises some weighty spiritual questions. If the simulation hypothesis is valid, then we open the door to eternal life and resurrection and things that formerly have been discussed in the realm of religion, Gates suggested. The reason is quite simple. If we're programs in the computer, then as long as I have a computer that's not damaged, I can always rerun the program. Or maybe even take this particular block of code and move it to some place in a nicer environment. And maybe correct some of the code in the process as long as the code person doesn't object. It is interesting to note that several people who would usually be considered atheists are willing to entertain, this is my take now, separate from what they had to say, are willing to entertain what is for practical purposes a God hypothesis. And notice that it's partly on the basis of ID arguments. For a simulations creator has what can only be described as godlike power. It can do anything, literally anything. All you got to do is change the code. And you can plop it in wherever you want to. An alien civilization capable of creating life, which is probably the least godlike, would still be godlike from our perspective. He could, or it, could separate the Red Sea in front of escaping slaves to keep them from being conquered by what was at that point the most powerful empire anywhere on the planet at that time. So all those miracles in the Bible could actually have happened without violating natural law. Or in the case of the code writer, perhaps while violating natural law, but natural law is not natural law, it's just the way the program usually operates. As Robert Wright notes, the attitude towards aliens or simulation programmers is significantly different from that of the traditional God. That is, people are much more comfortable having a simulation runner who does whatever he wants to do than they are having a God who does whatever he wants to do. This attitude cannot be explained simply by the concept of a higher power, because in all of the scenarios that have been suggested, there is a higher power. Or even a negative attitude towards miracles, because miracles are possible in both of the scenarios I mentioned. The disparity in attitudes, believe it or not, is actually demonstrated by Richard Dawkins. And for this, I'm going to take you to another YouTube.
In the book.
Well, then who did create the heavens and the earth?
Why do you use the word who? You see, you immediately beg the question by using the word who.
Well, then how did it get created?
Well, by a very slow process.
Well, how did it start?
Nobody knows how it started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life.
And what was that?
It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule.
Right, and how did that happen?
I told you we don't know.
So you have no idea how it started?
No, nor has anybody.
Nor has anyone else. What do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in evolution?
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet. Now, that is a possibility and an intriguing possibility. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe.
Well,
but that higher intelligence would itself have had to have come about by some explicable or ultimately explicable process. It couldn't have just jumped into existence spontaneously. That's the point.
So Professor Dawkins was not against intelligent design, just certain types of designers, such as God. So that
I think the mask is coming off. The real problem with intelligent design and with actual creationism, which is distinct from intelligent design, but uses some of the same arguments sometimes, quite often in fact, is actually an anti-Christian attitude. Keep this in mind the next time someone uses the usual dodges to avoid the force of intelligent design arguments. It's not about intelligent design, it's about God. But that's my opinion. Now it's your turn. Yes.
I just think right as a, I would say, technical comment. Hamilton's kin selection formula was adopted and generally accepted throughout the biological community as a possible explanation for why are we altruistic, which is a very basic question that's been asked out there, and this was followed for a long time. It's still followed right now by many.
Scientific ideas die hard.
But in my book, Science Discovers God, I describe some of the details of this. And interestingly, the man who had probably promoted this more than anybody else, E.O. Wilson at Harvard, for about 40 years, a few years ago.
Whose specialty, if I remember correctly, is ants and bees and
Right.
things like that.
It was
that cooperate very, very nicely.
Social behavior of animals and so on. And but you see it in birds, you see it in other organisms, and of course we are concerned about suffering in others and so on. Why do we have that? If evolution and survival of the fittest is the goal, you should not have any concern about that. And he, towards the end, he said, this does not work. Hamilton's formula and so on, kin selection, does not work. It's been stretched and stretched here and stretched there, like we do when we have dominant paradigms with excuses and so on. And he finally decided, hey, this does not work. The only reason we have kin selection is by chance. This adds a little bit to this mystery, which we all have. Why do we have a concept of right and wrong if we just evolved?
Why wouldn't might mean right precisely?
Might being right and forget about everything else, type of thing. So I'm glad to see this going on. Comment many things here. I think your last comment about why in the world don't we? If you're going to accept all this imaginary stuff here, you might as well believe in miracles. I mean, you've moved into miracle mode.
Well, you do believe in miracles, or at least you believe in the possibility of miracles.
But you won't accept the miracle of the Bible that is has such strong authentication. By far the world's most popular book, exceeds any other book that's ever been produced, and so on. No, you get into a creation, you get into a recent creation, and having to have a flood and all this, they're not ready to go there yet, but they're on the right track.
Well, they've moved away from the absolute atheism of their compatriots into a kind of well, it isn't God, but it's a very powerful figure that basically can do whatever he wants. Yeah, you're right. Yes.
Discussion points something out that I think we as Christians need to be, what we think about, and we need to be a little careful about if we accuse each other of certain things. For example, the soul. We, as Adventists, have one view of the soul, but it's perfectly reasonable to read the Bible in another way and come up with a different idea about what the soul is. Life after death, hell, some of these things we dismiss with, I think, good reason, but other people think that they also have good reasons. There's some very interesting comments in Ellen White which relate to some of these issues, one of which I wrote in my Bible because it was so startling when I read it, about what happens to us at death. And she says who we are goes back to God, where he holds us and then puts us back together, but not with the same atoms and that sort of thing.
Does she say holds it in memory by any chance?
I don't know, no. But I've heard a lot of people extend that comment and say things like, well, God must be holding whatever the soul is of us in a computer bank someplace. And so these kinds of questions sort of come to mind with a discussion like you've presented this morning. And I'm not trying to make a particular point here. It's just that it's not as simple, and we don't have the exact answers in our hand like we sometimes like to think we do.
And sometimes we may not even have the concepts to be able, that sometimes in this kind of thing, the poem of the blind man and the elephant matches. That we've never seen an elephant, we don't know what it looks like, and so we find parts of it that fit our theory and glom onto them while ignoring other parts of the theory.
My wife stirred up an example. Those of you who are older might remember the Reverend Bishop James Pike, Episcopal bishop, who with his wife went to Israel on vacation, took a jeep ride out into the desert. The car broke down. He walked for help. She was picked up by Israeli soldiers and taken to safety, but he disappeared for a while. They searched and finally found his body. He had fallen off a little cliff, landed on a ledge. When they took that news to Mrs. Pike, she said, "I know, I've already seen it. I saw his soul come out of his mouth, rise up through the air to meet his brothers, Kennedy and other famous people that had gone before, and he's now with them, and everything's just dandy."
There's one aspect.
After you, he'll take it.
Go ahead.
There's one aspect of this. There's several. All of this, of course, is really old stuff. By that I mean 3,000 years. It's Platonic. Plato and his co-thinkers in their think tank, that one of their main obsessions was whether or not we're all real or it's an illusion. And he had layer upon layer of reality, which ended in illusion anyway. And he had a whole system for replacement, a substitution of God, which he called by such non-specific names as form and the one and monad. None of this is at all new except for the plugging in of a computer into the equation. Now, another thing I'd like to point out is the prevailing mood
of whimsy. It's even referred to as entertainment. These aliens out there have done all of this mainly for entertainment. That also has been in play for several hundred years now. I think it probably can be stated to have started in the Enlightenment with Voltaire, when his whole attitude was satire and candidity. And that has progressed and evolved, if you wish, into really an art form. What is postmodernism if it isn't whimsy? The main philosophical device of postmodernism is whimsy. The idea that nothing is real unless it has been invented this morning, and nothing is less real than what was taken for granted or considered the foundation of philosophy and civilization yesterday. And therefore the whole thing is whimsy. And the really practicing and expert virtuoso postmodernists are not only proud of their whimsy, but it's their main approach to it. And what you've cited today, and incidentally is extremely well written. One who has tried to write anything at all has got to be overwhelmed with how beautifully written it is. It's New Yorker kind of writing. It's all in a sense of whimsy.
Well, it comes from New York.
And
so.
that, I think, really typifies all modern thinking now. Nothing is real. It's all virtual. And so why not use the analogy of simulation? Simulation, what is simulation other than virtuality and artificial reality and artificial intelligence? It's another word for the same thing. And what is the desire for taking drugs and alcohol other than to achieve a kind of unreal status in which you can just laugh the whole thing off? That isn't, in at bottom, is really another way of dismissing God. He's a laughable person. Now, I see on the screen up there something that I, as a kind of an artist, really do admire. That is a beautiful piece of satire. Look at the angels in the classical form on the left and right, and the caricature of an alien standing up as a central intelligence. I could say more because this really does fascinate me. The idea of where this is leading to, the virtual reality that's taking over, and the idea that it's all laughable, it's all entertainment, but let it go at that.
Well, actually, it's interesting. The picture there, of course, is one that is reminiscent of, if not deliberately, well, I think it probably is deliberately reminiscent of the resurrection of Jesus. And you see, they can accept an alien. They can't accept Christianity. And I guess this is part of the point that I'm making, is that there's all kinds of problems with the standard construction. Nobody wants to admit them until they have an alternative that will allow them to avoid taking Christianity in particular at its word. Yeah, well, and in fact, the idea that the gods created people for their own entertainment goes back pretty close, or at least the germ of that idea goes back to the ancient Babylonians, where people were created to do all the menial work for the gods. the gods wanted to party a little more and didn't want to be tied down with duties, so they created people to do that. And so this kind of thing you see a lot.
I think this is perhaps one of the situations in which we need to be careful about how our minds are influenced by atheists who are looking for ways around God. This is a fascinating theory about simulation. Maybe God is a computer programmer. Maybe there's a physical computer somewhere that, a supercomputer that does all this. It's not true. That God is not a computer programmer. We do not live in a simulation. The Bible is what shows us what reality is, and we're not simulations. We are in reality. If that makes sense, I think it does. So I guess I would add a word of caution that when we are exposed to concepts that are produced by atheists, that we need to be careful that we don't become sort of enamored and then sort of begin toying with ideas that maybe they're onto something. No, they're not.
Good point.
Comment here, and then yes.
Yeah.
So I get to go next?
Go ahead. And then
Simulation. This, it's interesting. I'm not enamored with it because it's so speculative. Now you can turn right around and say, well, what about all your biblical concepts? Are they not speculative? I'm a little more sympathetic to the theme of the great controversy where God is trying to save humanity from its selfishness and all that's through this great controversy process. There's a purpose here, an eternal purpose, that to me is much more valuable than just a simulation game.
You had
Ariel.
mentioned they can accept aliens but not a god. Well, they're accepting a physical being, not a supernatural. That's the point there, and that goes back to the Drake equation, which has been around since the 1960s.
Oh, I know.
Why they had no problem with it is because it tried to predict the number of alien civilizations in the universe, and that wasn't a problem because they're all physical beings. We weren't talking about
Right.
supernatural beings.
I mean, there are problems with it in terms of physics, like how do you get life out of nothing? Still hasn't been solved.
Well, but it is measurable. We have the technology to look for life on other planets.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
you can say, well, it exists whether you like it or not.
Yeah. If it's there, then it doesn't matter how it got there. It's just there, and so it proves that.
True.
It gives them a number that they can put into the equation and calculate the number of civilizations in the universe.
And by the way, the same equation will work for if there's an intelligent designer. How many designs did he put out there?
Well, it just adds one more parameter onto the equation.
Right.
That's all. And in all of those, there's just 7 parameters in the equation. So, it's not very in depth any one of them. And I think this growth out of to this simulated universe is somebody will probably find it's parallel to the legalization of pot in the country as well. and
Maybe more of a parallel than we'd like. But anyway.
But really, if it's a theory, it's really not much any different than the multiverse theory. I mean, it's if you've got programmers, then anything can happen, and so it's just another version of the multiverse theory, is what it is.
Kind of.
Yeah, because
what it is it allows intelligent design without the intelligent designer being God. That's what it does.
Yeah, but
you see, the person who did for example, is a junior high school student. He's doing his science project.
Yeah.
You see, he is not somebody with great moral sensitivity that really doesn't like it when you behave in certain bad ways.
Yeah, it still can't go beyond speculation because it's not testable. Just like multiverse isn't testable. You know, because all the evidence, whatever evidence you find, will be simulated as well. So you just can't test.
Yeah.
It's not a testable theory. So
the origin of life currently either isn't testable or has failed all the tests, depending on how you want to look at it. It's either an unfalsifiable theory or it's a theory that has already been falsified. So the origin of life is not scientific. That is the origin of life without a God. To say that the origin of life happened on Earth without any designer is to say, well, it happened and we know there's no designer.
Well,
and that's basically an atheistic theory.
Well, any logically possible theory is never can be perfectly falsifiable anyway. You know, it depends on the detail that you're trying to get at. But anyway, it's you know,
well,
this is an interesting discussion about what's happening in the scientific community. But it really parallels a lot of other things that have been going on for a while anyway. So I'm not surprised.
Yeah. Well, I'm not too surprised either, because usually this kind of stuff is covered up by arcane jargon that is very hard to peer through. But the truth of the matter is they know there are miracles. They don't want a God, so you have to figure out how to do it without. And this is one of the ways, or several of the ways. As we comment here, and then we have another one down here. Go ahead.
I have what I hope is an interesting personal question. We have these very intelligent people who find intelligent design so compelling that they're inventing aliens or simulations or this or that. And I don't mean to trivialize those particular theories, because I find them awesome and quite compelling. But if these intelligent, thoughtful people are willing to run to the idea of aliens or simulations, what are we doing that makes Christianity so horrendous that they wouldn't run to us? Like, if someone's willing to run to aliens, what are we doing on a personal level, which is a little outside the discussion of this class, and maybe something for personal reflection, that would turn people towards aliens and not towards the beauty of Christianity?
Well, I would say that there are what I would call good reasons, bad reasons, and ugly reasons. Good reasons would be we don't always exemplify the Creator whom we tout. Okay? And, somebody caught in the middle of the Inquisition is not going to find Catholicism attractive. And if Catholicism is the only Christianity around, then they're going to kind of throw the whole thing out. I think that the concept of an ever-burning hell is really hard to swallow. And according to one author, created a lot of atheists, and still doing it. But there are also bad reasons, and sometimes they're admitted to, such as when Aldous Huxley said that they wanted their sexual freedom, and God wouldn't allow that. Not the Christian God, anyway. So those are bad reasons. Those ones I don't think we can remove by buffing our Christianity.
If I could, I think the bad reason, the one that you mentioned, which is sexual freedom, I think we have something so much more beautiful and fulfilling. So it sounds like we may have we have something so personally compelling, which is the narrative of Christianity, both the story of Christ and what it does to us, that I don't see how, if we're conveying that idea to the world, if we break down the barrier of intellectualism, which is somebody resisting Christianity based on an intellectual reason.
Right.
As long as we break that down, I don't see why they're not coming to Christianity, which makes me think that I need to stop and reflect, what am I doing in my own life that's preventing these people around me from coming to Christianity and is leading them to go to aliens? Like, why is it that aliens are more compelling than Christianity? What am I personally doing to contribute to this issue?
Actually, it's a very important question, but I think that that the answer is not entirely on us. And the reason I say that is because I think that even if you had absolutely perfect Christians, that it does not mean that they would fit into the world or that the world would accept them, because there was an actually absolutely perfect Christian who came once, and the world did not accept him. They wound up crucifying him instead. And so I think to say that if we were just better, it would all work out, isn't true. However, I do think that there are some times when we don't do better and it doesn't work out, and it is on us in that case. And I think that there's a third reason, which is kind of the ugly reason, and that is because some people have just been brought up not to believe any of this stuff. You know those guys, they don't know anything. And the phrase overwhelming evidence comes up all the time in that situation, when in fact it's not really overwhelming evidence, but it is being touted as such so that nobody looks at it too closely and starts to ask too many questions. Because if it were overwhelming evidence, they would be pointing out, well, what about this, and what about this, and what about this, and what about this, and really nailing us to the wall with it. So there is what I would call the ugly reason, which is, oh, everybody knows that stuff is no good. You're a modern person, you're a scientist, how can you believe any of that stuff? And so it's an attempt to kind of sway people without actually doing the work of making sure that it fit. And so I think that if you're approaching somebody who, and I'm going to be doing that in the next few weeks, including this next week, if you're approaching somebody, you need to find out what reasons people are really, in this particular case, and you may have to speak to the good reasons, you may have to speak to the bad reasons, and you may have to speak to the ugly reasons as well. And you may have to find out for any particular one conversation where that person sits regarding those kinds of reasons. Does that kind of sort of answer your question?
My question was more directed for personal reflection. I agree, and I think your perspective is great. Meet the people where they're at, identify what motivates them, and speak to everybody on their own level. So I appreciate that thoughtfulness.
Yeah, I just have a couple of really quick comments. I see more of a positive take on this, that it's an opening wedge for this scientist, for many of them. And my second comment is that years ago at the Adventist Forum in San Diego, someone talked about emergence. Is that familiar to you?
Yes.
Anyway, is that something along the same lines?
Kind of. Emergence is basically a miracle without attribution.
Oh, okay.
It happened. We have no idea how, but it must have been natural because we know only nature exists. But if you don't know nature only exists, then emergence is another word for miracle.
Like ants know what to do and everything. And just another quick comment. When I worked at a church publication, I had an editorial once that where I mentioned this Ellen White going to heaven and speaking to two men that she had known. It was like going in some what do you call that? Travel into the future kind of thing. And when I mentioned that having to do with something else, they made me change it to virtual reality. Now, what So, I don't know, what, is there such a thing as some kind of time travel? Is there something like that?
Well,
is it virtual reality?
Could God give you a vision of time travel? Of course. Daniel gets to see a little piece of the future, distorted, summarized, but he doesn't see actual armies and stuff, but he does see a head of gold, a belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, a chest and arms of silver, of course.
So she didn't really talk to these people? Or?
Maybe not. Maybe not.
Okay.
But see, in vision, all kinds of things can happen. It's not required to be reality of the kind that we usually think of. And I mean, if you can do that kind of programming if you want to. And while I think that God's thing is much better than our computers at present, I think that it's very possible that there is enough similarity to where it's not totally blasphemous to speak of it as God's computer.
Yeah, we had your earlier comment that, that a lot of this going on in the scientific community does have the effect of making God look laughable and trivial, because it just obscures in all this discussion the possibility of that the existence of a supernatural God is just just an idea in somebody's head, just like all these other things. And so somehow we want to emphasize that all that does is introduce moral relativism, and what we're talking about is much more than that. That there is an objective universe that is really meaningful in the true sense of the word. Because what we're seeing here is making the universe, again, not meaningful. It doesn't help us in that direction because it's still all very relative, and in the postmodern sense. And so I think it's a good discussion to have for us to be talking about this, because it's just brings into light the importance of pushing the moral component of this intelligent being that we is the creator of this universe, because that's very critical. That's the one thing that makes us stand out, and so it's a good topic.
Well, with that, I think we'll quit for today. And those of you who are coming, remember, don't come next week. Come the week after, and we'll have 190 million year old collagen for you on display. I encourage not too many to do that, because I don't know what their capacity is going to be, but as long as we don't have the whole group over, it will probably be okay.